Imagine a single speech, 20 minutes that stunned the world's richest investors, turned a small African nation into a global powerhouse, and sparked a $1.2 billion deal that reshaped the continent's future. How did one unnoticed leader pull off this impossible triumph? You won't believe what happened in that Dubai boardroom. In this fictional narrative, we witness how an unnoticed leader's 20-minute speech transformed into a $1.2 billion agreement and changed the world's perspective. Burkina Faso's leader, Ibrahim Traoré's unexpected triumph in Dubai didn't just alter one nation's destiny. It reshaped an entire continent's future. But what really happened in that boardroom that made the world's most powerful investors suddenly gather around him? The first rays of dawn pierced through Dubai's crystalline skyline. As the city awakened to another day of unprecedented wealth and ambition, the Dubai Global Investment Center stood like a monument to modern capitalism. Its glass facade reflected the golden desert sun, while inside, the marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers that had witnessed countless billion-dollar handshakes. Suddenly, at 8:30 a.m., the building hummed with the familiar energy of high-stakes international finance. Black Mercedes sedans and Rolls-Royce Phantoms formed an elegant parade outside the entrance, discharging their precious cargo of oil ministers, tech tycoons, sovereign wealth fund managers, and the various species of power brokers who shape global economics from behind mahogany doors and silk curtains. The Dubai International Business Forum had attracted its usual constellation of influence. Saudi princes arrived with entourages of advisors carrying briefcases that contained the financial fate of nations. Norwegian pension fund executives stepped out of their vehicles with the measured confidence of those who control trillions in assets. Chinese infrastructure giants moved through the lobby with the purposeful efficiency that had built bridges across continents and high-speed rail networks that redefined transportation. This was the epicenter of legitimate global power, a place where the world's financial architecture was designed, redesigned, and occasionally revolutionized. The kind of forum where a casual conversation over Turkish coffee could determine whether entire regions prospered or stagnated, where a handshake between the right individuals could redirect rivers of capital that would flow for decades to come. At 8 a.m., the main hall buzzed with polyglot conversations as translators moved between clusters of delegates like diplomatic chess pieces. Arabic mixed with Mandarin, English blended with French, Russian punctuated by Portuguese. The sound was intoxicating to those who understood that each conversation represented billions of dollars in potential transactions. Each exchange of business cards a possible gateway to transformational deals. At exactly 9:47 a.m., as CNN International was setting up their cameras for the morning's first panel discussion, a man entered through the building's side entrance. No photographers clustered around him. No security detail cleared his path. No assistants flanked him with urgent whispers about scheduling conflicts and protocol requirements. Ibrahim Traoré walked into the Dubai Global Investment Center alone. But he wore a charcoal suit that was impeccably tailored but unremarkable, a silver watch that suggested success without ostentation, and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to offer. His presence was magnetic in its understatement, the kind of charisma that drew attention not through performance but through authenticity. Most of the delegates were too absorbed in their own networking to notice the new arrival. Those who did glance in his direction saw only another face in the international crowd, another representative from the global periphery who had somehow secured an invitation to observe how real power operated. At a cluster of British petroleum executives, their conversation, animated by recent discoveries in the North Sea, barely registered as passage. A group of German renewable energy investors debating the merits of various wind farm technologies continued their technical discussion without interruption. Even the African Development Bank representatives, who might have been expected to recognize a fellow African leader, were engrossed in their own strategic planning session. The dismissal was subtle but pervasive. This was, after all, a forum designed for major players, the countries that controlled oil reserves, the corporations that owned technological innovation, the financial institutions that moved capital across borders with a few keystrokes. Burkina Faso, however dignified its representation, simply wasn't considered part of that elite circle. That assumption would prove to be the most expensive oversight in the forum's 15-year history. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum commanded the front of the hall with the effortless authority that comes from transforming a desert trading post into one of the world's most successful commercial hubs. Surrounded by his carefully curated inner circle, economic advisors who had helped design Dubai's meteoric rise, investment managers who controlled sovereign wealth funds worth hundreds of billions, development specialists who had turned ambitious visions into concrete reality, he reviewed the day's agenda with a methodical precision that had made him one of the Middle East's most effective leaders. The schedule was packed with the usual suspects, bilateral meetings with Saudi energy ministers to discuss regional power grid integration, private consultations with Norwegian pension fund executives about sustainable investment strategies, closed-door sessions with Chinese infrastructure conglomerates planning the next generation of Belt and Road initiatives. These were the relationships that mattered, the partnerships that moved mountains and redirected rivers. Burkina Faso wasn't mentioned in any of the briefing documents spread across the Sheikh's private table. Most of his advisors would have struggled to locate it on an unmarked map in the calculus of global finance. It simply didn't register as significant enough to warrant attention from the world's major capital allocators. But in a conference room overlooking Dubai's impossible skyline, that calculus was about to be dramatically recalculated. Traoré found an available seat in the third row of the main auditorium, settling in with the patient observation skills that served him well throughout his political career. Around him, delegates engaged in performative networking that defines these international gatherings. The exchange of platinum business cards, the scheduling of follow-up meetings, the careful diplomatic language that conceals as much as it reveals. He simply watched and listened, his keen intelligence absorbing every nuance of the conversation swirling around him, the body language of power, the subtle hierarchies that determined who spoke first in group discussions, the economic. This was an education of the highest order, a masterclass in how global influence actually operated behind the carefully orchestrated public ceremonies. The morning's opening session proceeded with predictable grandeur. A parade of ministers and executives took the stage to deliver presentations that were heavy on vision and light on specifics. Oil-rich nations spoke eloquently about economic diversification, while their budgets remained overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuel revenues. Technology entrepreneurs delivered inspiring speeches about digital transformation, while their own countries struggled with basic infrastructure challenges. European development officials offered generous aid packages that came with more conditions and oversight requirements than a mortgage application. It was the same script that had been performed at these forums for decades. The same promises, the same power dynamics, the same fundamental assumption that development was something that happened to poor countries rather than something they created for themselves. But at 11:23 a.m., that comfortable script was about to be torn up and rewritten. A crisis was unfolding behind the scenes with the kind of diplomatic urgency that makes seasoned event organizers break into cold sweats. The scheduled speaker for the next panel, a prominent African delegation leader who was supposed to address emerging market opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa, had been forced to cancel at the last minute due to a family emergency. His flight had been diverted to handle a medical situation, and his carefully prepared presentation was now orphaned on a global stage. This was a disaster in the making. The forum was being live-streamed to thousands of investors worldwide, with real-time social media coverage and international news teams capturing every moment. Empty podiums and awkward delays were the kind of organizational failures that could damage the forum's reputation for flawless execution. A junior Emirati aide, his diplomatic composure beginning to crack under pressure, scanned the auditorium desperately for a solution. His eyes landed on Traoré, who sat calmly in the third row, seemingly unperturbed by the growing commotion around him as organizers whispered urgent consultations into their earpieces. The aide approached with the kind of respectful hesitation that diplomatic protocol demanded when addressing an unknown quantity. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "I understand you're here representing Burkina Faso." Traoré nodded once, his expression neutral but attentive. "That's correct. We have a rather urgent situation," the aide continued, glancing nervously toward the stage where technicians were making frantic adjustments to buy time. "Our scheduled speaker for the African Development Panel cannot make it. Would you be willing to step in? The topic is emerging market opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa, and we desperately need someone who can speak authentically to that experience." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Traoré simply studied the young man's face. Then, without hesitation or fanfare, he stood up. The movement was fluid and decisive, carrying more natural authority than all the theatrical gestures of the morning's previous speakers combined. "I'll need 3 minutes to organize my thoughts," he said quietly. The aide's relief was almost visible. "Hawkins and colleagues." "Of course, sir. Thank you so much. The presentation materials and slides are already loaded." "I won't need them," Traoré interrupted with gentle firmness. "I have something better." As word spread through the venue's communication network that an unexpected speaker would take the stage, the atmosphere began to shift in subtle ways that experienced conference-goers immediately recognized. Conversations took on a different energy. Delegates who had been preparing to step out for coffee breaks reconsidered their plans. The CNN production team, initially frustrated by the scheduling disruption, began to sense that something potentially newsworthy might be about to unfold. The moderator, a seasoned BBC World Service correspondent who had covered international economics for 2 decades, stepped to the podium with professional composure that masked his curiosity about the last-minute replacement. He had learned to expect the unexpected at these forums, but something about this particular substitution felt different. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the packed auditorium, "we have a special opportunity this morning. Stepping in to address emerging opportunities in Africa, please welcome President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso." The applause was polite but perfunctory. Roughly half the audience was still engaged in their own side conversations, viewing this as an acceptable moment to attend to emails or finalize the details of their next meetings. Several investors used the transition to step out for coffee or networking conversations in the lobby. They would spend the rest of their careers regretting that decision. Traoré approached the podium with the same unhurried confidence he had displayed throughout the morning. The stage lights revealed the careful details of his presentation. The perfectly pressed suit that spoke of personal dignity rather than ostentatious wealth. The understated watch that suggested success without vulgar display. The bearing of a man who commanded respect through substance rather than spectacle. He looked out at the audience for 10 seconds without speaking. The silence grew heavy, expectant, magnetic. Conversations began to fade as more attendees turned their attention to the stage, sensing that something significant was about to occur. When he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly to every corner of the hall without strain or amplification. The accent was cultured, international, carrying the confidence of someone who had been educated in multiple languages and operated comfortably in diverse cultural contexts. "My country is not rich in oil," he began, his words measured and deliberate. "We don't have diamond mines that make international headlines or gold reserves that attract multinational corporations. We don't have tech unicorns or billion-dollar startups that grace the covers of business magazines." A few more conversations died down. Some delegates looked up from their phones, intrigued by the unconventional opening. "But we are rich in something far more valuable than any of those things. Potential that isn't for sale to the highest bidder." Now, he had their attention. The room was noticeably quieter, the ambient conversation level dropping as more people focused on the unexpected speaker. From his jacket pocket, Traoré withdrew not a tablet or smartphone, but a hand-drawn map. The paper was cream-colored, slightly worn at the edges from handling, covered in meticulous annotations in multiple colors of ink. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately, holding it up for the audience to see with the pride of an artist displaying a masterpiece. "This," he said, his voice growing stronger but never losing its controlled dignity, "is the West African Green Energy Corridor. Not a PowerPoint slide created by international consultants who have never set foot on our soil. Not a glossy brochure designed to extract promises from development agencies. This is a blueprint drawn by engineers." The CNN cameras, initially positioned for routine coverage, began adjusting their angles to capture this unusual presentation method. The Bloomberg reporter in the back row stopped, checking his phone, and started taking notes. Social media managers from major investment firms paused their scheduled posts to focus on what was unfolding live. 10 countries. Traoré continued, tracing routes on the map with his finger. Integrated solar and wind infrastructure that doesn't depend on foreign oversight or external maintenance contracts. Agricultural innovation zones powered by renewable energy and managed by local expertise. Transportation networks that connect landlocked nations to global markets without requiring them to mortgage their sovereignty in the process. At the 3-minute mark, a few delegates checked their phones one final time before putting them away entirely. By the 7-minute mark, Sheikh Mohammed himself rose from his VIP section and moved closer to the stage, his advisors following with the heightened attention that accompanies unexpected developments. At the 12-minute mark, the entire auditorium was silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the occasional click of cameras, capturing what everyone was beginning to realize might be a historic moment. Traoré was painting a vision that was both audaciously ambitious and grounded in practical reality. He spoke of drought-resistant farming techniques developed by local agricultural scientists who understood their soil conditions better than any foreign expert, of solar panel manufacturing plants that would employ thousands of people while producing technology for domestic use rather than export to distant markets, of transportation hubs designed to facilitate regional trade and cooperation rather than simply extracting resources for international consumption. "You've heard many presentations about investing in Africa today," he said, his voice carrying a subtle but unmistakable edge of challenge. "You've heard about opportunities to extract our resources, to provide aid with carefully written conditions, to develop markets that primarily serve external interests while providing minimal benefits to local populations." The room was completely silent now, every person present understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the typically scripted world of international development conferences. "I'm not here to ask for your charity," Traoré declared, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I'm not here to promise you easy profits from our natural resources or cheap labor from our people. I'm here to offer you something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world: genuine partnership in building a truly sustainably economic ecosystem that benefits everyone involved equally." At the 15-minute mark, the CNN correspondent was frantically signaling her production team to ensure they were capturing every word. The Financial Times reporter had already begun drafting what would become the lead story in the next day's international edition. Investment fund managers were discreetly making phone calls to their research teams, demanding immediate briefings on Burkina Faso's economic indicators and regional partnerships. At the 18-minute mark, Sheikh Mohammed whispered something urgent to his chief economic advisor, who immediately began making calls that would reshape the afternoon schedule and potentially the next decade of Gulf African relations. At the 20-minute mark, when Traoré concluded his presentation with a simple, "Thank you for your attention," the applause was not just enthusiastic, it was transformational. This wasn't the polite acknowledgement typically accorded to conference speakers. This was the sound of minds being changed, assumptions being challenged, and possibilities being recognized that hadn't existed 20 minutes earlier. The moderator returned to the stage, clearly energized by what had just transpired, and struggling to maintain a professional composure in the face of what he recognized as a career-defining moment. "President Traoré, that was absolutely extraordinary. I think I speak for everyone in this room when I say we'd love to hear more about the specific implementation timeline and partnership structures for this corridor project." But before Traoré could respond to what would normally be the beginning of a standard Q&A session, Sheikh Mohammed's senior aide had already reached the edge of the stage. The whispered conversation that followed was brief but intense, conducting the kind of diplomatic shorthand that experienced international operators use when urgent decisions need to be made quickly. It ended with a respectful nod from Traoré and a barely perceptible smile from the Sheikh's representative. "Ladies and gentlemen," the moderator announced, his voice carrying a new note of excitement, "we're going to take a brief intermission to allow for some individual consultations. President Traoré will be available for follow-up discussions after the break." The diplomatic language concealed a simpler and more significant truth. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, one of the world's most successful and influential leaders, wanted a private conversation with a man from Burkina Faso. Immediately, as the auditorium began to empty, delegates clustered in small groups, their conversations animated by what they had just witnessed. Business cards were exchanged with new urgency. Phone calls were made to headquarters in London, New York, Beijing, and Frankfurt. Social media posts began appearing with hashtags like hashtag unexpected leadership and hashtag Africa Rising. But the real action was already moving to a different venue entirely, to the kind of private meeting room where actual power operates, and trillion-dollar decisions are made over handcrafted Turkish coffee and dates that cost more per pound than most people's monthly salaries. The private consultation room was located on the building's 42nd floor, accessible only by a dedicated elevator that required special authorization to operate. The space itself was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes covered polished marble floors. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Dubai's impossible skyline, and comfortable leather chairs were arranged to encourage intimate conversation rather than formal presentation. This was where Sheikh Mohammed conducted his most sensitive business, where sovereign wealth fund allocations were decided, where international partnerships were forged or dissolved with handshakes that carried more legal weight than most written contracts. The room had witnessed the birth of projects that transformed entire regions, had hosted conversations that redirected billions of dollars in investment capital, had been the site of agreements that reshaped the global economic landscape. Sheikh Mohammed was already waiting when Traoré was escorted into the room, having shed the ceremonial aspects of his public role in favor of the direct, business-like approach that had made him one of the most effective leaders in the Middle East. He stood to greet his guests with the kind of genuine respect that successful people reserve for those they recognize as equals. President Traoré, he said, extending a firm handshake that conveyed both warmth and serious intent. That was the most interesting and substantive 20 minutes I've experienced at one of these forums in many years. Traoré accepted the compliment with characteristic grace, understanding that in this rarefied environment, such praise was not given lightly. Your Highness, I appreciate both the opportunity to vision, the sheik repeated thoughtfully as they settled into chairs positioned to facilitate honest conversation. You know, I hear that word constantly in these meetings. Usually, it means someone wants funding for dreams they haven't figured out how to actually construct or implement. A silver service appeared as if by magic, attended by staff who moved with the invisible efficiency of a world-class operation. Neither man immediately reached for the refreshments, both understanding that this conversation would determine far more than anyone in the main auditorium could possibly imagine. Your presentation was fundamentally different, Sheikh Mohammed continued, his tone becoming more analytical. You spoke like someone who doesn't actually need us. That's highly unusual in these contexts. Traoré smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he had shown since entering the building that morning. Respect isn't earned by those who beg for assistance, Your Highness. It's earned by those who build something genuinely worth respecting. The sheik laughed, a sound of genuine appreciation and recognition. Exactly right. But tell me something with complete honesty, because in this room we can dispense with diplomatic pleasantries and speak as one leader to another. Why should anyone believe that Burkina Faso and its regional partners can actually deliver on this ambitious vision? No offense intended, but the historical track record of large-scale infrastructure projects in sub-Saharan Africa is, shall we say, mixed at best. It was a question that everyone in the main hall had been thinking, but was too diplomatically polite to ask directly. The question that had derailed thousands of well-intentioned development projects over the decades. The question that had relegated countless African nations to perpetual role of aid recipients rather than genuine economic partners in global commerce. The question that separated serious players from wishful thinkers in the brutal calculus of international finance. Traoré didn't flinch or offer defensive explanations. Instead, he reached calmly into his leather briefcase and withdrew a tablet computer, sliding it across the polished coffee table to his host with the confidence of someone who had come prepared for exactly this moment. No promises, Your Highness, he said quietly. Just documented results. The tablet screen illuminated with a carefully curated portfolio of images and data that told a story more compelling than any PowerPoint presentation could ever achieve. These were photographs of infrastructure projects completed in Burkina Faso over the previous 18 months. Roads constructed ahead of schedule and significantly under budget. Solar installations powering entire districts with locally trained maintenance crews, agricultural innovation centers where thousands of farmers were learning drought-resistant techniques developed by domestic research institutions. Modern hospitals equipped with the latest medical technology, but staffed and managed by local professionals. Schools built with sustainable materials and designed by architects who understood both international standards and local cultural needs. Water treatment facilities that provided clean drinking water to rural communities while training local technicians to maintain and expand the systems. But what impressed Sheikh Mohammed most as he scrolled through the documentation wasn't just the infrastructure itself, impressive as it was, but the faces of the people involved in these projects. Workers who look proud rather than desperate, displaying the satisfaction that comes from meaningful employment rather than charity. Students in modern classrooms that have been built by their own communities, their expressions showing engagement and ambition rather than passive dependence. Farmers, standing in fields that have been transformed from subsistence plots into productive agricultural enterprises, their body language conveying ownership and optimism about the future. This represents entirely domestic funding, the sheik asked, his tone conveying both surprise and growing respect. Domestic resources strategically leveraged through intelligent partnerships, Traoré confirmed. We made a fundamental decision 18 months ago to stop waiting for external salvation and start building our own capacity systematically. The results, as you can see, speak for themselves. Sheikh Mohammed set down the tablet and leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine engagement. This was decidedly not the conversation he had expected to have when he woke up that morning. His schedule had been carefully packed with meetings he considered essential, oil ministers from neighboring countries seeking to coordinate regional energy policy, technology entrepreneurs with proven track records looking for Gulf capital to scale their operations internationally, established financial institutions wanting to solidify existing relationships that had proven mutually profitable over many years. Instead, he found himself face to face with something entirely different and potentially more significant. A leader who had actually delivered on development promises rather than simply making them, who was offering genuine partnership rather than dependence, who represented not a supplicant seeking assistance but a potential equal-seeking collaboration. The green energy corridor you described, the sheik said after a long pause filled with careful calculation. You're talking about coordinated infrastructure development across multiple sovereign nations. The coordination challenges alone will be extraordinarily complex. Significant but entirely manageable, Traoré agreed without hesitation. We've already secured preliminary agreements with 7 participating countries. The comprehensive engineering studies have been completed by teams that include both local expertise and international consultants. The financing structure has been designed specifically to ensure that each nation maintains complete sovereignty over its territorial portion, while benefiting from the collective efficiency and reduced costs that come from integrated regional development. And you're seeking Gulf investment because your region understands infrastructure development at the scale we're envisioning. Because your expertise in managing complex international projects with multiple stakeholders is genuinely unmatched anywhere in the world. Because partnership with the UAE automatically provides credibility in global financial markets that would take us years to establish independently. Traoré paused, allowing a slight smile to cross his features. And because we can offer you something that no other region currently can, first mover advantage in what represents the world's last great development opportunity. The sheik remained quiet for several minutes, processing not just the specific proposal, but the broader implications of everything he had heard. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Dubai's skyline stretched toward the horizon, a living testament to what became possible when ambitious vision met competent execution, when international partnership created something genuinely greater than the sum of its individual parts. Finally, he spoke with a directness that had made him one of the most effective leaders in the region. What would you $1.2 billion over 5 years? Traoré replied without hesitation, clearly having anticipated this exact question. Half in direct investment, half in loan guarantees to facilitate additional private sector participation. Technical expertise in renewable energy systems, particularly in desert and semi-arid applications. Project management support for the regional coordination aspects, drawing on your experience with multinational infrastructure development. And, perhaps most importantly, your public endorsement and active participation in international markets, which would provide credibility that cannot be purchased at any price. And in return, we would receive Full partnership in the fastest growing economic region in the world, with guaranteed access to emerging markets that will represent hundreds of millions of consumers within the next decade. Preferred access to agricultural products and mineral resources developed through sustainable methods that align with global environmental standards. A showcase project that demonstrates Gulf African cooperation at its absolute finest, providing a model for a South-South partnership that could be replicated globally, and the personal satisfaction of building something transformative that will outlast both of our political careers. Sheikh Mohammed stood and walked to the panoramic windows, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out the city he had helped transform from a modest desert trading post into one of the world's most dynamic commercial and financial centers. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Ambitious vision supported by practical planning, international partnership that respected local autonomy, and the fundamental willingness to think beyond conventional limitations and established categories. When he turned back to face Traoré, his decision was already clear, though the diplomat in him required formal due diligence. I want to review the complete engineering reports with our technical teams. I want to meet personally with your key project managers and financial advisors. I want comprehensive guarantees about governance structures and transparency mechanisms. And I want this entire arrangement structured so that success benefits everyone proportionally, while failure doesn't bankrupt anyone involved. Traoré nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose homework had been thoroughly completed long before entering the room. All of that can be arranged within the next 2 weeks. Our teams are prepared to provide any level of documentation and access you require. Then let's make some history together. The handshake that followed was firm, brief, and carried more financial weight than most countries' entire annual national budgets. But beyond the immediate monetary implications, something more historically significant had just occurred in that room overlooking Dubai's glittering skyline. A fundamental shift in how Africa would engage with the global economy, moving from perpetual recipient to genuine partner, from resource extraction to value creation, from dependency to mutual respect. The formal agreement ceremony that took place 3 hours later was almost anticlimactic by comparison. By then, word had spread throughout the conference center that something extraordinary was unfolding. The main auditorium was packed beyond its official capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens hastily set up in adjacent meeting rooms. International media representatives who had initially come to cover routine trade discussions were now scrambling to understand and report on what appeared to be a genuinely historic development. Social media platforms were buzzing with speculation about this surprise announcement emerging from Dubai, with hashtags like #NewAfricaPartnership and #DubaiGameChanger trending across multiple continents. Investment analysis firms were issuing rapid updates to their clients about emerging opportunities in West African development projects. Academic institutions were already beginning to plan conference panels and research projects focused on this new model of international cooperation. But for those who understood how real power actually operated, the meaningful moment had already passed in that private room where two leaders had recognized in each other the rare combination of vision and competence that makes genuine historical progress possible. The document signing ceremony was conducted with appropriate diplomatic ceremony, but refreshing minimal fanfare. The agreements were substantial and comprehensive. A $1.2 billion green technology infrastructure development fund jointly managed by Dubai-based investment institutions and African development organizations, with transparent governance structures and clear performance metrics. A commitment to establish the Gulf African Institute of Technology with modern campuses in both regions, and an ambitious mandate to train 5,000 engineers and technical specialists over the next decade. A comprehensive trade framework that would facilitate not just additional resource extraction, but value-added manufacturing, technology transfer, and the kind of economic diversification that creates sustainable prosperity rather than boom and bust cycles dependent on commodity prices. Most importantly, the agreements established a new paradigm for international development cooperation, one that treated Africa as a capable partner rather than a needy client, that recognized the continent's capacity for innovation and leadership rather than simply its requirements for assistance, that created structures for mutual benefit rather than one-sided extraction disguised as aid. As the ceremony concluded and the assembled crowds began to disperse, the broader implications of what had just occurred were only beginning to register across the international development community. This wasn't merely another investment deal or standard cooperation agreement. This represented a fundamental paradigm shift that would influence how international development partnerships were structured and evaluated for years to come. The global media response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Bloomberg's international edition led with a headline, "Unexpected Partnership at Dubai's Summit Fundamentally Reshapes African Investment Narrative." The Financial Times ran a comprehensive analysis titled Gulf African Deal Signals Revolutionary New Approach to Development Finance. The Wall Street Journal's editorial board praised the agreement as a mature model for South-South cooperation that Western institutions would do well to study and emulate. But perhaps the most significant response emerged from social media platforms, where young Africans across the continent shared clips of Traoré's speech with captions like, "Finally, someone who negotiated instead of begging. And this is what genuine leadership looks like in the 21st century." The hashtag #AfricaBuilds began trending across multiple countries, with users sharing their own stories of local innovation, entrepreneurship, and community development that contradicted stereotypical narratives of dependency and dysfunction. In Paris, a senior French development official was overheard telling his colleague, "We have completely underestimated him and the broader movement he represents." The comment, captured by a journalist and later published in Le Monde, became part to African engagement that had been based more on historical relationships than contemporary realities. In London, British investors who had previously dismissed Burkina Faso and similar countries as too risky for serious consideration were suddenly scrambling to understand how they had missed what was clearly a major economic opportunity emerging in real time. Private equity firms were urgently reaching out to their Africa research teams, demanding comprehensive explanations for why they hadn't identified Traoré and similar leaders as significant players months or years earlier. In Washington, State Department analysts were hastily updating their regional briefing documents and scheduling emergency consultations to understand the implications of a major Gulf African partnership that had been negotiated and implemented without American involvement, oversight, or even advance notice. The geopolitical implications were only beginning to be understood, but they were clearly significant. But perhaps the most important response was occurring in African capitals themselves, where other leaders were carefully studying the Dubai model and asking themselves what similar approaches might accomplish in their own countries and regions. Confidential phone calls were being placed between Accra and Nairobi, between Lagos and Kigali, between Addis Ababa and Dar es Salaam, between Dakar and Harare. If Burkina Faso could command this level of international respect and partnership, what might be possible for countries with even greater natural resources, larger populations, or more developed infrastructure? The ripple effects were spreading across the continent as other leaders began to reconsider their own approaches to international engagement, their assumptions about what was possible, and their strategies for achieving genuine economic transformation rather than simply managing dependency more efficiently. 1 week later, Traoré's chartered aircraft touched down at Ouagadougou International Airport just as the sun was setting, painting the West African landscape in the warm golden hues that seemed to promise better days ahead for a region that had endured more than its share of challenges and disappointments. There were no military bands waiting on the tarmac, no red carpets or formal reception ceremonies. That theatrical approach to leadership had never been his style, and it certainly wasn't what his people needed to see from their president. Instead, what awaited him was something far more meaningful and historically significant. Word had spread organically throughout the capital city that their president was returning from a successful mission to Dubai. Market vendors had closed their stalls early and made their way to the airport. University students had walked miles from campus to be present for what felt like a genuinely historic homecoming. Engineers and teachers, farmers and small business owners, civil servants and entrepreneurs had all somehow learned about the return flight and decided that they needed to be there to witness this moment. As Traoré's aircraft rolled to a stop and the passenger door opened, hundreds of citizens had gathered spontaneously, not in the orchestrated fashion of authoritarian political theater, but in the organic way that communities honor achievements they genuinely understand and respect. The crowd didn't cheer wildly or shout political slogans. Instead, They held up handmade signs, heartfelt messages crafted in homes and workshops across the city, expressing emotions that had been building throughout the week as news of the Dubai Agreement had spread through social media, radio broadcasts, and countless personal conversations. We saw, we believe, Burkina Faso rises with dignity. No more begging, building only. Our president, our pride, our future. Africa stands tall today. Traoré walked to the gathered crowd methodically, shaking hands with workers whose callous palms told stories of honest labor, embracing elderly women whose eyes reflected both pride and relief that their country had finally found its voice on the international stage, lifting children onto his shoulders so they could see over the crowd and remember this moment for the rest of their lives. But throughout these interactions, his demeanor remained characteristically composed and focused on the future rather than the present celebration. This wasn't a victory parade or political rally. This was the beginning of the most challenging phase of his presidency, the period when promises made in air-conditioned conference rooms would need to be transformed into concrete improvements in people's daily lives. In his brief remarks to the assembled crowd, delivered without amplification but somehow reaching every person present, Traoré kept his message simple, forward-looking, and grounded in practical realities of implementation rather than the euphoria of international recognition. Today, we celebrate not what we received as charity, but what we earned through our own efforts and competence, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering. Tomorrow, we begin the real work of building the future we have envisioned together. The respect we gained in Dubai was just the beginning. Now, we must prove that we deserved it. As his motorcade made its way through the streets of Ouagadougou toward the presidential palace, people lined the roads, not because they had been instructed to do so by government officials, but because they wanted to be part of something that felt genuinely transformative. Children waved from their parents' shoulders, seeing in their present success a reflection of possibilities for their own futures. Elderly residents emerged from their family compounds to catch a glimpse of the leader who had brought dignity to their nation's international relationships without compromising its sovereignty or values. But Traoré understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that celebratory procession, that the most challenging work was just beginning. The agreement signed in Dubai was a framework and an opportunity, not a guarantee of success. The real test would come in the months and years ahead as his administration worked systematically to transform international commitments into tangible improvements in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and economic opportunity. That evening, in his private office within the presidential palace, Traoré gathered his closest advisors and technical specialists to begin the detailed implementation planning that would determine whether the Dubai partnership became a transformative success story or another well-intentioned international agreement that failed to deliver meaningful results for ordinary citizens. The conference table was covered with engineering reports, financial projections, legal documents, and strategic timelines. His economic development minister spread out detailed maps showing proposed locations for solar installations and wind farms. His foreign affairs advisor reviewed the intricate legal frameworks that would govern international partnerships while protecting national sovereignty. His infrastructure planning chief presented updated construction schedules for the first phase of the regional energy corridor. His education minister outlined plans for the new technical training programs that would ensure local workers could build, operate, and maintain the advanced systems being developed. His finance minister detailed the complex funding mechanisms that would leverage international investment while maintaining fiscal. The easy part is finished, Traoré said quietly, studying the documents that would shape his country's trajectory for the next generation. We've earned international respect and secured financial commitments. Now we must prove that we deserve both the respect and the investment. Outside the palace windows, Ouagadougou was settling into its evening rhythms, but with a palpable difference in the atmosphere. In neighborhood markets and university dormitories, in small workshops and coffee houses where young entrepreneurs gathered to discuss business ideas, in family compounds where multiple generations shared meals and stories, people were engaged in conversations that hadn't been possible for decades. These were discussions filled not with resignation about limited opportunities or dependence on external assistance, but with genuine excitement about possibilities that seemed achievable. For the first time in living memory, students were talking about staying in their home country after graduation rather than seeking opportunities abroad. Young professionals were considering starting businesses that could serve regional markets rather than simply surviving on subsistence activities. Families were making long-term plans based on confidence that their investments in education and skill development would actually pay dividends in their home communities. For the first time in a generation, the dominant emotion in conversations about the future was hope rather than desperation, possibility rather than limitation, pride rather than shame about their country's place in the global economy. The transformation was psychological as much as economic, cultural as much as financial. A small West African nation had demonstrated that it was possible to engage with global power structures as an equal partner rather than a supplicant, to command respect through competence rather than sympathy through need, to build sustainable prosperity through indigenous capacity rather than temporary stability through external dependency. The man who had made this transformation possible was already back at his desk, working by lamplight as he reviewed technical specifications for solar panel manufacturing equipment and transportation infrastructure blueprints. He had walked into that Dubai conference hall alone and unnoticed, carrying nothing more than his nation's potential and his own unshakable belief in what could be accomplished through dignity, preparation, and unwavering commitment to his people's capabilities. He had walked out with $1 billion partnership agreement and something far more valuable, proof that African nations could rewrite the terms of their engagement with the global economy, that developing countries could transition from resource extraction to value creation, that international cooperation could be based on mutual respect rather than charity disguised as development aid. The story that had begun in a marble-floored conference center with polite indifference and skeptical dismissal had evolved into a new chapter in the long narrative of African development, one written not in the familiar language of aid dependency and resource extraction, but in the emerging grammar of partnership, mutual benefit, and shared prosperity. And in capital cities across 2 continents, other leaders were taking detailed notes, studying the Dubai model, and wondering whether they, too, might find the courage to walk alone into rooms where they weren't initially expected or welcomed, carrying only their vision and their absolute refusal to accept anything less than the dignity and respect their people deserved. The implications extended far beyond immediate financial commitments or infrastructure projects outlined in the formal agreements. This represented a fundamental shift in how international development could be approached in the 21st century, moving away from paternalistic models that had dominated North-South relations since the colonial era toward genuine partnerships based on mutual interest and shared capability. Academic institutions around the world were already beginning to analyze the Dubai precedent, scheduling conferences and research projects to understand how this model might be applied in other contexts. Development economists were revisiting their assumptions about capacity building and technology transfer. Political scientists were examining the diplomatic strategies that had enabled a relatively small country to command attention and respect from major global powers. International development organizations were being forced to reconsider their standard approaches, their assumptions about African capabilities, and their methods for measuring success in development partnerships. The traditional metrics of aid effectiveness were proving inadequate for evaluating relationships based on mutual investment and shared risk rather than donor-recipient dynamics. But perhaps most significantly, the success of the Dubai Partnership was inspiring similar initiatives across the African continent. Regional economic communities were exploring new models for infrastructure cooperation. Bilateral relationships between African countries were being strengthened and expanded. South-South partnerships were being developed that bypassed traditional North-South channels entirely. The psychological impact was equally profound. An entire generation of young Africans had witnessed their continent engage with global power structures as an equal partner, had seen their leaders command respect through competence rather than plead for assistance through desperation. The narrative of African capability was being rewritten in real time, with implications that would influence educational curricula, career aspirations, and national development strategies for decades to come. International investors who had previously viewed Africa primarily as a source of raw materials or a destination for charitable initiatives were beginning to recognize the continent as a potential partner in creating new industries, developing innovative technologies, and building sustainable economic systems that could serve as models for other developing regions. The transformation wasn't limited to economics or politics. Cultural perceptions were shifting as well, both within Africa and internationally. The stereotype of African dependence on external assistance was being challenged by evidence of indigenous innovation and self-directed development. The assumption that meaningful progress required Western oversight or guidance was being contradicted by documented examples of successful African-led initiatives. Media coverage was evolving from the traditional focus on conflict, poverty, and dysfunction toward more nuanced reporting on economic innovation, technological advancement, and political leadership. International news outlets were assigning correspondents to cover African business and development stories with the same seriousness typically reserved for European or American economic news. Educational exchanges were expanding as international universities recognized the value of learning from African innovations in sustainable development, resource management, and community-based economic planning. Research partnerships were being established to study African solutions to global challenges. The ripple effects continued to spread, creating momentum for additional partnerships and initiatives that built upon the precedent established in Dubai. What had begun as a single agreement between Burkina Faso and UAE investors was becoming a catalyst for broader transformation in international development approaches, South-South cooperation frameworks, and African integration strategies. 6 months after that pivotal morning in Dubai, the first concrete results of the partnership were becoming visible across West Africa. Solar panel manufacturing facilities were under construction in 3 countries, employing thousands of local workers while producing technology specifically designed for regional climate conditions. Transportation infrastructure was being upgraded to support increased trade flows between participating nations. Agricultural research centers were developing crop varieties that could thrive in changing environmental conditions while maintaining nutritional value and market viability. The new technical training institutes were graduating their first classes of engineers and technicians, young professionals who would spend their careers building and maintaining the infrastructure that would power their region's economic transformation. These graduates weren't seeking opportunities abroad. They were staying home to participate in building something unprecedented in modern African history. International recognition continued to grow. Traoré was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly, the World Economic Forum, and numerous other international gatherings, where his insights on sustainable development and South-South cooperation were increasingly sought after by leaders from both developed and developing nations. But the most meaningful recognition came from his own people, who could see tangible improvements in their daily lives as a result of the partnerships their president had negotiated. Rural communities were gaining access to reliable electricity for the first time. Urban areas were benefiting from improved transportation networks and expanded economic opportunities. Students were accessing educational resources that prepared them for careers in emerging industries rather than traditional subsistence activities. The psychological transformation was as significant as the material improvements. Citizens who had grown accustomed to being described as recipients of international charity were now seeing themselves and their country described as partners in innovative development initiatives. The shift in narrative was empowering individuals and communities to think more ambitiously about their own potential contributions to national and regional progress. As the first anniversary of the Dubai Agreement approached, planning was already underway for expanding the partnership model to additional countries and sectors. The success of the initial implementation had generated interest from other African nations seeking similar partnerships, while Gulf investors were recognizing potential for profitable long-term engagement with African markets and institutions. The story that had begun with one man walking alone into a conference room where he wasn't expected had evolved into a movement that was reshaping international development paradigms and creating new possibilities for millions of people across multiple continents. The transformation continued, driven by the simple but powerful principle that genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared capability could achieve results that traditional aid relationships had never been able to deliver. And in that same presidential office in Ouagadougou, where detailed implementation planning had begun a year earlier, Traoré continued his quiet work of turning international agreements into improved lives for his people, proving every day that the respect and investment his country had earned in Dubai had been thoroughly deserved and wisely utilized. The man who had walked in alone had indeed walked out with $1 billion agreement. But more importantly, he had walked out with something that no amount of money could purchase: The unshakable confidence that his people and his continent possess the capability to build their own prosperous future, partner with the world as equals rather than supplicants, creating value rather than simply extracting resources, and writing their own story of progress and dignity. Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about justice and comeback victories that will restore your faith in standing up for what's right.